Thanks, Debbie. Hi, welcome everyone. Hello, hello. I am Sherry, author of Say It Now, 33 Creative Ways to Say I Love You to the Most Important People in Your Life. And I'm so happy today that we have Frank and Chelsea here. And you'll see when they introduce themselves and talk about their books that I think it's just such an appropriate day to have you two here to be talking about your special work and what's going on. So why don't we start, Chelsea? Why don't we have you start? And you have your book there that you can
Sure. My pleasure.
And Chelsea, why don't you also just let us know personally, what have you been doing lately to take care of yourself during all of this?
Sure. Well, first of all, my book is a sudden loss survival guide, 7 essential practices to heal grief. And it's packed with tips and coping tools to work through grief. And it is meant for grief of losing a loved one, but so many things are applicable to what's happening now, like the different tips and tools you can use, because grief is grief no matter where it comes from. So yeah, it'll be nice to share a few things with the audience. And then for myself, for self-care with our unusual times, I noticed I've really been stepping back. I've stepped off of social media. I'm more cocooning in the house because there's so much turmoil and strife around us. And being an empath, like I'm sure a lot of the audience members are, where we can pick up on other people's feelings, I've had to be super careful with my self-care because I can just almost feel what's happening in the world. Yeah, so it doesn't always feel good. So I've been doing a lot of blessings of myself, people around me, wishing peace for others. So a lot of more spiritual type work, more than I do normally, and more of it, more time to do it. So.
Hey, Chelsea, what have you noticed about being off of social media?
I don't miss it. So I noticed that being an empath, like if I look on Facebook, I'll pick up on how people are feeling. So that did not start my day well. There was a certain person I follow because I kind of like to get her daily reading. So I would read that first thing in the morning because I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Then, I'd start looking at other things, and those did not help my day because, you kind of see the strife other people are going through or what they're talking about. And it wasn't always uplifting. So yeah, I found for me, looking at social media in the morning, especially a bad idea. So I'm trying to get more into a better routine. And when my book came out recently, I was on it quite a bit, of course, because you're promoting your book. So now it's kind of nice to step back and rest a little because it's not helpful for me personally.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that in. And also what you were saying about allowing yourself more time for spirituality and quiet and, that's great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Hey, Frank. Thank you for being here too. Same thing, if you would hold up and share your book with us, and then also let us know, how have you been taking care of yourself?
So this is the fear paradox. And I guess, through this time, we've had a good amount of fear.
Oops, wait, Frank, you got muted.
Oh,
there you go. I think you're back.
Well, I guess I was just saying that, obviously fear is something that we've all been kind of dealing with, a lot in the last 6 months, and maybe longer, right? And so, for myself, I guess, I work as a psychologist. So, I spend my days, working with people in this medium and, that's been obviously very meaningful. I think it's been helpful for me, to be able to be with people in their kind of emotional struggles. I find it meaningful. But it is important, of course, to make sure that I have sufficient self-care. For me, I love to play tennis. For me, if I can get out there and really just sort of have a good hour and a half or hour of tennis, that kind of exertion really sort of, just kind of feeds my soul, a very kind of rich way. So I think, I found with the people I work with that exercise and I think just working up a sweat, I think is really, really positive. For me, emotionally is more difficult, right? And I think, that's, I think, where we find challenges, and a lot of, with the people I work with, a lot of different approaches.
Yeah. Well, do you have one to share that's worked for you personally that you've used for that aspect?
Well, if we, for all emotions, I guess, and for me, perhaps with fear in particular, is, the importance of leaning in, right?
Mm,
That, I think part of the problem with our emotional lives is when we turn away, right? And we can tend to abandon ourselves, right? Which, I think just creates more problems. But particularly I found with fear, it's particularly problematic for all of us because we tend to fear. and,
yeah.
and so, when we start to move away from fear, and this is a little bit of what my book is about, is that, fear will turn on us. And the more we try to stay away from fear, it has a paradoxical kind of phenomenon where it actually starts to grow. And, so many of the efforts societally and personally that we do to kind of move away from fear, to be courageous, to be strong, to deny our fear, uh, it seems to backfire. And so what I've tried to do is to sort of gently kind of lean in
Yeah.
to our fear.
Yeah. I bet you have a lot more to say about that, and I'd love to hear, because that's, that is such a great thing. So both what you just said, the physical, really being in our bodies and being, like you said, I love that, working up a sweat can help so much. And then also, instead of doing what we usually do, which is, repelling from fear, but like you're saying, gently lean in. I love that gently piece. And I think, Chelsea, that's a little similar to what I've heard you say about grief too, isn't it?
Sure, definitely. To me, grief and fear, yeah, very similar, different emotions kind of on the same vibrational level, low vibration, right? Um, yeah, and I find people grieving, exactly what Frank said. We're taught, isn't it time you move on? Isn't it, aren't you over it yet? It's
Mm.
been a year. And really, this can be for any type of grief, like divorce, job loss, whatever, because in Western society, I don't think we're taught how to deal with our emotions. And I have a 14-year-old son, and I'm learning that now because he has a girlfriend. So it's so funny to see how when other people come into our family, what their emotional levels are and what they're taught from their families. I'm seeing the societal patterns in teenagers already, what they're learning, what they learn from their parents, the false beliefs. So I'm trying already to start correcting some of that the best I can, because it's kind of like we're just fed a bunch of stuff, crap that doesn't help us with our emotions, right?
Right.
So, and I was curious for Frank, like, how do you get people to be aware of exactly what their fears are? Because with grief, we'll kind of take an inventory of what they're feeling. So, what do you ask them so they really know what they're afraid of? Because sometimes we might not even know.
Mm. Yeah, thank you, Chelsea. I think that's a great observation and question. It is really problematic, right? Because I think, you know, with all of our emotions, right, we're not, as you say, right, we're not taught, to have emotional intelligence. We're not taught to sort of say, oh, what's going on in my body? Like, what is that
Yeah.
sensation? Like, oh, that sensation, that's sadness, right? Or that's grief, right? There's some loss I'm feeling, right? We're not taught. But I think in some ways, right, you're identifying a particular problem, and maybe very meaningful now, is that it's really hard to know what we're afraid of. and I think it's part of, part of how, fear has come to be so valuable to us biologically, right? But it's also, I think, what makes it so hard for us to deal with, because what it turns into for us is anxiety. And so anxiety is, right, as I think about it, is that vague, right, objectless, fear. And so that's one, when it sort of moves into anxiety, it's very hard to sort of extract or to distill down, what are you afraid of? Like, what's going to happen, right? And to follow that, right? And it's often very elusive, right? I think, one of the things that I just had a conversation recently, about someone being afraid of death. And it's a common fear. I'm afraid of death. How many,
Sure.
right? Everybody's afraid of death, right? Aren't they? And I guess in some ways, what I sort of, sometimes, discover in that is that there's something more essential, right? That there's a fear of loss, right? Which I think is partly what you're sort of working with. That, in the, a fear of being alone, or a fear of being abandoned, or a fear of, what's on the other side, that there's often something more essential involved in that. And one of the things I think that I try to get to in the book is that, for me, one of the most essential fears for us is the fear of the dark. And that's a metaphor, of course, but it's for us right now, I think it's very, very powerful, because it's really uncertainty. It's really what we don't know. It's what we can't control. So I guess, to answer your question, it's not easy to figure out what we're afraid of.
Sure, sure. And before our call, I knew you talked about fear. So I thought, okay, well, what is my biggest fear? So I was thinking of it. And my biggest fear is, since I've lost my parents and have had other losses in my life, my biggest fear is losing another loved one. And I think the way I cope with it is I help other people, because I teach them skills. So it's almost like I'm preparing myself for when the inevitable comes again, because I know how painful it is. And now I feel through my book and work with other people, I have the skills, the tools to work through it. So it's almost like I've been preparing, unfortunately, for 20 years, because I realize, yeah, that is my biggest fear. And that's actually driving my work. And I do find it meaningful, of course, to help other people. But it's like I have an ulterior motive, because, loss happens, it's inevitable. So I just want it like a toolbox to work through it.
I like what you're saying, very much. And to me, this idea, that you're expressing is it's inevitable, right? And that's obviously that's an important part, right, of grieving, right? Is I imagine, right, is acceptance, right? And that's that leaning in.
Sure, sure. Yeah, that's a good way to say it, because most people, of course, never come to acceptance, because they kind of relate, like, the more I suffer, the more I'm proving my love I had for this person. And really, that person, the person who died, would want you to go on and have a great life, live in their honor. But it's like we hold on to it so tight, just we don't want to forget. And of course, we'll never forget. That's impossible to do. But I think that's one of the issues that people have, because we can't accept it. We want to hold on. We don't like to separate.
No. There's one thing you said that I was curious about, when you talked about, just how painful it would be to lose someone else, right? Do you, how important in your work is pain? Like the tolerance of pain, or the acceptance of pain?
Sure, sure. And I try to move people from pain to love, being that in this, I believe our spirit, our body, our soul goes somewhere else. So I try to get people to tap into that, like the continuing bond of love is always there. You're going to have a new, different relationship. So it's interesting you asked me that question, because that really is my answer, because I do have a continuing bond with my parents who passed away. I teach other people to do that. Sometimes, of course, people are skeptical, but who cares if it makes you feel better? If you find comfort in what you're thinking, I say do it. So yeah, I tend to focus on the love, but that's only because I went through the pain and I had to learn the hard way. I had a mentor, teacher to help me through the grief process, because I did it all the wrong way, like stuffed your feelings, numbed yourself, all the way we're taught in America, to deal with feelings.
Yeah.
So yeah, I hear what you're saying. Great question.
Yeah, I'm curious, Frank. Oh yeah, would you say some more about it yourself, Frank?
Well, I guess what I'm hearing is this, that I like very much is, what you just said in passing, but it sounds very important, is I moved through the pain and I got to the love.
Right.
And to me, that's that, that gentle leaning in, right? Because, in some ways, part of what I mean, it's a big statement, and I don't mean it to be so, big or categorical, but, the real antidote to fear is love.
Sure.
I believe that, it's not courage, it's not strength, it's certainly not denial. It's when we love that strongly that it brings us into life, even when we kind of, have all this, reality to be afraid of.
That's a wonderful thought. That just your statement alone seems to bring comfort. And I think what I've been doing with what's happening around us, like in Wisconsin, we have a lot of it's a big swing state for the election. So people are really uptight about that. So I see signs all over, for different candidates. So when I go by the signs, I try to gently bless them, send them love, because I'm trying to accept everyone's different opinions. Because I know if I'm not sending out that love, if I'm sending out negativity, of course that's going to come right back to me. So I am trying to be in the world more with love right now. When Sherry initially asked, how are we taking self-care? Yeah, so that's definitely a big point. And I'm glad you pointed that out, because I don't quite think I realized how much I really was focusing on that just as a coping mechanism.
Where are you from in Wisconsin?
Green Bay. So we're very close to the Packer Stadium. In fact, we have Packer players that don't even live very far from us, because it's a small town. So, yeah. I mean, relatively small. So
I grew up in Milwaukee.
Oh, okay. So yeah, the Midwest background, right? Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Where are you now, Frank? Where are you located?
We're a little bit north of New York City.
Oh, okay.
So it's kind of a small town, but it's it's close to the city. But right now, of course, it doesn't really matter. Right, one could be anywhere, USA. But yeah, it has a little small town feel. But there's sort of a there's a lot of people who are artists and writers and different people who are kind of creative around in the neighborhood. So it's been kind of fun.
Yeah, Marlena.
It's not Creek Locks or Kingston or somewhere in there, is it?
No, we're further south. We're in Hastings.
Okay, because there are a lot of those artist types that are up in Creek Locks in that area in Kingston.
Yeah, Katona and Hudson and right. There's a lot of Where are you located? Oh, you're in Oregon.
We're in Oregon now. Yeah, my husband grew up in Creek Locks in upstate New York, so so we've been there. I wanted to comment on the you talked about the importance of love as a way to move away from fear, Frank, and that is really profound, and I love that. And I'm wondering if an intermediate stepping stone might be what Donna Markova talked about a few weeks ago on this panel, and I've been writing about actually since then, which is the importance of wonder in our lives. And can we, in a place of fear, as many of us are right now, step into wonder? You know, if we can't get to love, can we step into wonder about what is it behind the curtain, behind the darkness, in that place of uncertainty? What might there be that is birthing right now? And that it just seems like that's a really important, potentially stepping stone toward leaning into love.
I love what you're saying. You know, it's that word is very powerful in my mind, and it's a word that I use a lot in my work. Right? It's
That's great.
You know, and what's so powerful about it, for me, is that it asks us to sit in our seat, right? To just sit down and to not be moving out too quickly, right? We're going to wonder, right? Which it sort of requires us to just be wherever we are and to open up and to see what's here.
Yeah.
Let's wonder about this, right? And we have to let go of what we think we know, right? And to sort of say, yeah. And so I love that. And it's interesting to think of that as an intermediate step between us and love. I think that's really cool.
I have a question for Marlena. How has it benefited you in your wonder practice? Like, have you noticed how you're feeling better, or?
I am practicing it actively right now, and yes, I do think it has a calming effect, because instead of focusing on the unknown and all of the fear that's around me for so many reasons, from Black Lives Matter to COVID to these horrific fires, what can we do but step back and wonder, what is birthing here? What is it we need to be getting? What will arise, almost the way fall and winter kill what lushness was there in the summer, but it's all so that new life can grow. And that's it's such a miracle when you think about nature in that way. And then can I take that on? So more directly to your question, yes, it has a calming effect for me right at this moment.
Oh, that's awesome. And I was thinking you meant wonder even more like what you see that's a wonder to look at, like the sun, the flower.
Yes and.
Okay.
Yes.
I love that. I love what just happened, and that it's a yes and, because that is something about the word wonder, right? That's so interesting, that double entendre. I'm just curious, did anybody else want to jump in, who's here? Because this is such a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, I'll.
Go ahead, Linda. Oh, Linda.
Oh, no,
Okay.
Go Linda. Linda, go ahead. I'm still kind of forming my thought. Go ahead, Linda.
Oh, first of all, Wonder Woman.
That's neat.
Took me a long time to actually make that connection, but wonder is something that's very important to me in terms of the awe of wonder in nature. But like I said in the chat, Valerie Kaur's book See No Stranger, it starts with a chapter about wonder because she sees that as so important in getting past our fear of each other, or of the other. That wonder is how we open that door to learn about each other. And I've been working with her book for a couple months now, but I'm struggling a lot with the wonder right now about others in all this divisiveness. I've been challenged to wonder about people who hurt other people. But her book talks about there are no monsters, there are only people who are wounded. And so, hurt people hurt other people, that kind of thing. And I'm trying to keep that in my practice, that wondering about other people, but I have been challenged by it in this time of, you know, us versus them and them versus us, and, you know, seeing each other as adversaries instead of just having conversations. But I'm working on it.
Nita, did you want to jump in now, or are you still formulating?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure it'll ever get. I formulate so much better with my fingers on a keyboard than in my, unless I'm like right in my area. So thank you both, Chelsea and Frank. I'm really, really enjoying this conversation, especially the idea, and I may be paraphrasing, but kind of sort of being with the uncomfortable, because I think that's, I mean, there's such a draw to, can't we transform this? Can't we turn this into something else? Can't we make this? And my experience has been, not yet, not yet, not now, maybe tomorrow, maybe 10 minutes from now. But if I don't go through that first part, that discomfort, then it inevitably I end up back in the black hole. So so I really like what you talking about the wonder. I would call it curiosity, but I like the word wonder actually better. It's kind of more, you know, magical. And the idea of you know, I'm a meditator, so that's, everything comes back to thoughts and body sensations for me. And so that's kind of how I'm hearing this conversation, is through that filter, that I have to be with what is before I can go anyplace else. And so that's just, I was just going to kind of throw that out there. Again, I may have completely misinterpreted what you said, because I'm listening through my own filter, which we all do. But yeah, I'm really, I've already read Chelsea's book and I adore it. And so Frank, you're on my list, so yay.
So, Nita, am I tried to take a little bit of a glance, you know, at the names, you know, of people you know, that I saw on the invites, and am I right that you're a runner?
Yes. Oh, that was the other thing. I don't know if you heard me when you saw, I can't help myself sometimes, when you said that you had to break a sweat to get, I was like, yeah, my little ears, that's the doggy ears perked up. So yeah, that's the other thing, is getting just my body moving, even if it's just walking around the block. So I really appreciated what you talked about, the tennis and your, you know, get your heart rate up a little bit. And for me, that's been, I hadn't stopped running, but because of some book related things, I just wasn't getting to it as much. So my self-care right now has been tons more meditation and tons more really, really slow, really long runs. So yeah, did you have a question? I interrupted you. I'm sorry. I'm going to mute myself because that'll happen again.
I didn't have one. No, thank you.
Well,
oh, go ahead.
Question for the group. You know, we're using the word self-care, and really it's like self-love. And I noticed recently what I've been asking myself, and I used to do this as a practice and I got away from it, and I know consistency is key, but now I've been asking myself, if I loved myself, I would, to get me away from doing the things that I think I should do, because those things you should do is, of course, what causes our anxiety and happiness, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, I've really been trying to be like, if I loved myself, I would. And then the answer comes clearly to me. Do I want to do this? No, I don't really want to. You know, so I think that's an easy question we can use to kind of check in with ourselves before we get rattled up with anxiety or whatever's happening in the moment for us.
Were you asking people to respond, Chelsea? Did you want to hear?
I was just wondering, I just like the term self-love. I know we were using self-care, but I guess it's the same thing. Self-love, how are we loving ourselves? How are we being gentle with ourselves? Yeah, loving ourselves, taking care of ourselves. So yeah, just a different term, but I just like that term.
Yeah. Well, and I like your question, because what came up for me, also a meditator, and I think that plays into it, is that sometimes my first answer to something like that might not actually be the true answer, because that first one might come from the thinking mind rather than something that arises.
Right.
So for instance, sometimes it might be something like self-love would be, I just want to, you know, watch a movie right now and just forget everything, right? Whereas as we've all been talking about, sometimes the deeper, truer answer is, you know, maybe to sit and meditate, or to take a long walk, or to talk to a friend about something that's going on. Maybe that might not be the first answer, because it's actually the Frank's leaning into something that ego, or, you know, the monkey mind doesn't want me to do. So that's what came up for me when you asked that. I'm curious for other people, what came up for them. Debbie?
Yes, I have a similar response to you, Sherry. Because I think at a lot of times what I think is self-care isn't actually that beneficial to me. So when I sit with it a little longer, then I realize, oh, maybe, you know, going for a walk is a little, because I sit all day, maybe that's a little healthier than watching a movie. Or maybe painting is, for me, is a good expression. Maybe that's, even though it takes work to get myself to the studio, but once I do, then I get all this reward. So I feel like I really agree with you. And I think embracing that, just even if it's just 2 or 3 minutes of sitting before action has really benefited me.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, to get more to our higher vibration activities that help us. Because, yeah, I could watch a Netflix movie, but yeah, that doesn't help me really feel better. Just numb me out, which is our problem when we go to those numbing activities. So yeah, definitely a super good point.
You talked, Chelsea, before too about, yeah, numbing or stuffing things down. Like, for instance, I think food is a common thing that many of us use. You know, it's like, well, I'm going to have this treat, you know, and in the moment, maybe it feels like it's loving, but you know, afterwards, you know, there's that anxiety and the sort of like, oh, I shouldn't have done that, and I don't feel good, and yeah.
Sure, yeah, because we're not mindful. So that's both what you and Debbie were getting at, to make the mindful decisions of what's happening. Certainly, yeah, that's a good point.
Hey, I want to ask, if it's okay, Frank, I'm kind of curious about the word paradox in your title.
Yeah, well, I guess in some ways it's what we're kind of, you know, talking about. Because I guess, you know, in some ways the you know, the paradox, I guess, that I try to sort of talk about a little bit is that, you know, is the way in which, you know, fear, the more we try to sort of, you know, deal with our fears and our insecurities, the sort of the way in which those tend to backfire. And, you know, and I guess, you know, there's what we're talking about in terms of when we're sort of run away from our emotional life, right? It sometimes creates other bigger problems. But I guess, you know, I also look a little bit, you know, at some of the societal things, like, you know, for instance, like, you know, social media, which I guess we talked a little bit about, you know, at the beginning, that, you know, social media, I guess, is, you know, has the intention of bringing us closer together, right? Of connecting us, you know, to, you know, people in the world, to our friends, to our families, you know, and to make the world a smaller place. And that, you know, presumably, you know, we might imagine that that was based in a sort of an insecurity, right? That we gain security by connecting. Community is probably, right, we might say, you know, about increasing our security. And so I think, you know, we do connect, we do attach to other people to improve our security. And I think what's happened, right, you know, I guess we could all comment what we think has happened with social media, but I think generally we'd have to say it has actually alienated us, you know, from each other much more than it has brought us together.
Say more. Don't stop there, Frank. Say, just, I'd love to hear. Like, tell us more about that.
Well, I guess, you know, there's different examples, perhaps, you know, that in, you know, for instance, you know, in World War II, when, when there was clear indications that Germany was working on an atomic bomb, and so scientists went to Albert Einstein and they said, listen, you have to go to the president, you have to go to Roosevelt personally, right? And you have to tell him that you are aware of this and that we have to beat them to build this bomb. And so Albert Einstein, this incredibly, brilliant, wise, moral human being, right? Is the one, that some people feel is responsible for getting Roosevelt to put the resources behind it, to build the bomb. And look what it's done. I mean, we killed hundreds of thousands of people, innocent people, to make ourselves more secure.
I have a question for Frank. How do we use fear as our friend or our fuel? I thought that's maybe what you meant by the paradox of fear. Like how does it help us?
Well, what do you think?
Well, what do I think about that? Well, I guess maybe it makes us go more into our feelings to think about what do I really fear. So as we're more aware of our feelings, we can release it. We can release the fear. It's almost like, yeah, you have to go towards it before you can release it, to descend into it, transcend. So yeah, I guess, yeah, it goes back to what you're saying, leaning in. We go towards our fear, don't we? Even though I don't want to.
Yeah. I mean, I like what you're saying, because I think that is, I think a reality that, that is paradoxical about fear, right? That it is something that we tend to move away from. And we do so because it can be very limiting, right? I mean, that's the problem with fear, I guess, is that, it has the potential to hold us back from things that we know will be in our best interest, right? That we're afraid of the wrong things. And that, when I'm afraid to apply for a job, or I'm afraid to, ask someone, to have a relationship with me, and my fear holds me back, that's unfortunate, right? And it's limiting. And fear, in some ways, right, tends to kind of impact our well-being, in that we tend to sort of get, to live in a smaller and smaller world, right? One that we can control and one that is ordered. And so, yes, we have to realize that, and this is tricky, is that, fear is a very primitive, experience for us biologically, and it only cares about our existence. That's all it wants, is for us to continue to exist. It doesn't care whether we're happy or sad or depressed. I mean, you might say depression is a concern, right? Because it affects procreation, perhaps. But it really, I think that's the problem, is that, it's a different part of us that wants our well-being. Because fear isn't a problem for other animals. Other animals, right? There's a little chipmunk, and the hawk, screeches above, and, the chipmunk runs away. That fear is vital to the survival of the chipmunk. And for us, it's much more complicated. And I guess, I think there are a couple of things about us as human beings that have made fear our enemy rather than our ally.
And how would we make fear our ally? Because I was thinking back to college, for example. I was fearful that I wouldn't get good grades, as a basic example, let's say. So, I studied hard, I got straight A's. So when I was younger, in my 20s, I kind of became like a workaholic, because I was fearful of the consequences. Like, what if I don't get a good job? What if? So So, I mean, it made me go forward to look good for societal standards, like, oh, straight A kid, good job, blah, blah, blah. But then, like you were saying, I was pretty unhappy. So it's kind of like fear is almost the ego too. Like the way you were describing fear to me sounds like the ego. So yeah, how do we make it help us?
Well, so that's interesting, right? So I guess, so you're talking about like fear motivated you.
Yeah.
And I guess, you know, in some ways fear sort of, you know, shaped the trajectory, right? That you didn't want to deviate from a certain, you know, path that you felt would keep you safe, whether it's relationally safe because people would be upset with you, or whether you might not have enough money to live, right? But that fear was saying, you better do this or else, right? And so you follow that path. I guess the tricky thing, you know, when just going back to when we were talking about love, right? You know, I think there's all kinds of different motivation. And I think a different motivation would be, I love this, you know, job so much, I want to do it. Or I love helping people, or and then I think that's a different, it might take you on the same path, but I think your well-being would be affected differently.
Sure.
What's interesting about what you guys are saying, what's dropping in for me, is that in our culture, at least in the United States, I've often heard that, you know, in advertising or marketing, that fear is a much more effective trigger, which I've always hated, you know, whenever I hear that, because I like what you were saying, Frank, and I'm much more, I like aspiration, you know, versus fear, like heading people into, this is what I want, or I dream about this, and this inspires me. But I do find it interesting. I don't know if that's still true, but I know at one point it was true. And I'm just curious. Yeah, Marlena, what?
Yeah, there's actually quite a bit of research on this, and I'm sure Frank knows more about it than I do, but fear is a very powerful short-term motivator. The problem is it won't sustain. It cannot sustain. It'll get you moving faster than just about anything else. But if that positive motivator is not there right behind it, it doesn't sustain itself. And Frank, I'm sure you know a lot about that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It is tricky though, because, you know, what's happens, you know, I think a lot in political advertising, right? And certainly, you know, Facebook is, right, the champion. Those algorithms, you know, continue to stoke, right, the fear. So yes, right, fear, I mean, I think biologically, fear doesn't disappear right away, right? You know, the animal that sees a predator in the distance, if the predator goes behind a bush, the fear doesn't immediately go away, right? It stays for a little while, but you're right? It does eventually sort of go down, unless that fear is continually stoked, and that's, I think, where it gets problematic. My sense, right, for human beings is when fear, it becomes chronic, where there is no let up, and so we're continually traumatized by the fear, and it becomes, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder, right, which is a state in which that fear doesn't dissipate. It stays in the unconscious and continues to motivate us. So I agree that it can, right, in the animal world, the threat comes, the threat goes away, right, and then the animal can relax. But if the threat continues to come, right, the nervous system of the animal never has a chance to sort of recoup.
Linda,
go ahead.
Yeah, I've thought about it in terms of animals before, and I think I kind of come back to it as mindfulness. So I don't I'm trying not to put the emotion of it on an animal, right? So from that perspective, it's more like alertness. So they're very present in the moment when they sense the hawk is nearby or whatever it is. And so they use that fear as just another source of information. And so that's how I try to think about fear, is that it's just more emotional information for me to look at and then decide what I want to do. But I very much have set an intention for myself years ago to not make choices from fear. So to use it as information and then pause, if at all possible, as long as it's not fear about my personal safety, and pause and decide what to do from there, that it's just an input. And just sort of a side note, the conversation about fear has brought up a quote, and I can't remember it. I'll have to find it at some point in length, but I've carried it with me ever since I first read it, because it was about love beyond your fear. So that's what I try to do, you know, be present with the fear, but then try to love past it, love beyond that fear.
I like that, Linda. Yeah.
I'll see if I can find it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I'm wondering, Frank, I'm thinking back to what you started us with playing tennis, right? And I'm thinking about right now, it just seems, I try to stay off of the general media as much as I can, right? Because it just seems like there's just a fueling of fear. And you started to say like what that does to our bodies over time. And I think that's where it really links what you were talking about, and you know, how important it is that we move to get all of that moving through our bodies, because I feel it, you know, and I really try to stay off media, and yet still it seeps in, you know, it's impossible not to just feel the oppression of it.
So I guess, you know, that that's a question, you know, I'm curious, like, you know, staying off of media, right? I mean, I think, you know, but it's sort of like, how do we balance that with, you know, kind of, you know, knowing what's going on? Like, isn't that important, right? How do we do that?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I ask myself all the time. I mean, I will tend to, again, we all choose our own media, right? So I might I get the New York Times headlines in the morning, so I just kind of glance through that. And I am on social media because of my work, that I'm on social media a lot. So I might glance at things. But I'm constantly in conversation with myself about that, you know, how to stay informed and who to trust, you know, what sources to trust and what sources aren't just sort of fueling, you know, that fear. It's a great question. What do other people have to say about that?
I know for me, I tend to not be informed by my choice, because I know if something major happens, I'm going to hear about it anyhow, just through a conversation with a person, or the little bit that I might be on Facebook, and I do get the headlines. So it's my choice actually not to be informed. Probably not the answer most people like to hear, but that works for me, you know, because I get upset when I don't watch the 5:30 news. Well, it's 5:30 here, the world news. I don't watch it because it's too upsetting for me, but that's just how my body reacts. That's how I react. So. Yeah, so everyone's different in how they cope with what's happening around us, definitely.
Linda, were you going to add something?
For me, I definitely limit the sources and the time. Like, I can't look at social media and the news past a certain time at night, or I won't get to sleep. And I can't look at it before I do my meditation in the morning, because then it's very, very difficult to settle into my meditation. So for me, I have to limit the time that I consume that sort of thing. I do have a question or something I wanted to say about a different subject. Can I shift back to grief?
Yeah, you know, we're informal here, Linda. Just jump right in. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. I wanted to just say thank you for stating that there are so many other types of grief besides the loss of a person. I went through a very in-depth grieving process when I got divorced years ago.
Oh, sure.
And one of the most powerful things that I did for healing in that process for me was I wrote a eulogy for my marriage. As the marriage itself, as something separate, you know, that I needed to grieve that. And that really was an incredibly healing process for me to write that, to see it for what it was, for what it could be, and for the good things that were in it, you know, like actually just write a eulogy for it. And you know what a type of grief that I had never heard anybody talk about before that I experienced personally was going through menopause. That there was a process of grief there that was really unexpected and much more intense than I would have thought. And I don't know if anybody else has experienced that.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely, because you're getting older. It's like another loss, like loss of youth, loss of your body not being able to do all the same things it did before. And I'm so glad you brought that up about the different types of grief, because it really angers me in our society. We have like a hierarchy of grief. So the important thing you did, Linda, was you acknowledged your grief yourself. I hope other people acknowledged it in your life too, because I think it just helps people to bear witness to their grief, acknowledge it. Because oftentimes with grievers, someone might lose like a sibling, and then someone's like, well, you didn't lose so and so. So I just cannot stand that. That is, everyone's grief is unique to them. All loss hurts, no matter what it is. And that's with the pandemic, people were having loss of financial security, loss of being with other people, isolation, all kinds of things happening. So as we know, they weren't recognizing it as grief. So once people become aware of it, name their grief, name it to tame it, that kind of comforts us. Name what's happening for you, acknowledge it, and then begin the release process, whatever that is for you. And wow, what a great example you did. Write a eulogy. Did you share it with anyone or burn it, or what did you do after you wrote it? That was the process of getting it out?
I actually did take a copy of it, and because I do a lot of writing and a lot of contemplation by the river here where I live, and I set it into the river and let it go.
Oh, is that nice that it kind of flowed down the river?
Yeah.
It's almost like
there was that releasing.
Yeah, it's almost like it was blessed. Wow, that's an awesome idea. Good for you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Do you have advice for people? Because like grieving right now, when people can't even gather together to grieve in somebody's life that they've lost. What are you recommending for people?
Sure. Yeah, and typically the best thing you can do for grief is have that ritual, that memorial where you get together. But as you say, if we can't, depending on the state or what's ever happening, you can just have a ritual yourself, whether with a few people, just yourself, whatever, because it's kind of like you're triggering yourself, telling yourself, okay, I'm beginning the grieving process. I'm saying hello to my grief, goodbye to the physical presence of the person, but now I'm going into their spiritual presence, let's say. So yeah, whatever ritual will work for you. And that's what funerals really are. They're a ritual. So it's simple as releasing balloons, writing a letter to the person, whatever, having a little altar in your house. And it's simply what you did. You almost had a ritual of some sort where you wrote out everything you were thinking. So yeah, ritual is key just to start the process, to acknowledge what's going on, because that's so often missed, that we're not acknowledging all this loss that hurts, whatever it is. Yeah.
Chelsea, how are you experiencing, grief right now in terms of, COVID and our needs to sort of, keep our distance from people and stay away from certain kinds of activities? Like, what's happening with grief? I mean, it feels like
Sure. Yeah, and I think, like how I mentioned earlier, people weren't realizing they're grieving. All these things were happening and they didn't realize what was happening to them. And I think, of course, a lot of people still don't realize, because we're not taught perhaps to be in tune with our feelings, or not everyone has as much emotional intelligence, depending on what your study or what your background is. I'm not picking on anyone by any means. So I personally think it's getting a little better just because of the education. People are understanding, workplaces educate their employees on what's happening, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it is a little better, and we're adapting. But I think the big thing is just realizing what was happening, and I think a lot of people still don't.
How about the same question, Frank, about fear?
Well, I don't know. I guess, I was still on the grief. You know,
Oh yeah, that's okay.
well, I guess this idea of like, a lot of people don't recognize that there is loss or recognize that there is something's different, right? I think that's one of the things. I guess it's just for me during this time, it's been like really just mind blowing how profoundly capable the human being is of denial.
Oh.
That literally that we can literally wipe out reality. I mean, it's, I guess, with, and I guess I was thinking of that with what you're saying with grieving, right? You can't grieve unless you recognize the loss. You can't grieve unless you say, wow, like our society is being hit by something incredible right now, and look how it's impacting us. So many people are, right? I mean, to feel it. I guess that's, I got just that just struck me. Yeah.
And I like how you use the term something different's happening. Like what an easy question someone could be like, oh, what's different? Something's different happening? When something's different, it's happening. It's a change, and change usually is a loss. So I think that's a great way to simplify it. Something different's going on. It might not feel good. That could be a potential loss. What are my feelings about this? How can I release the feelings? How can I talk about it?
Yeah. Well, and I guess it's also when you say when there's change, there's loss, because, right, even if it's I think a lot of people are experiencing what's going on today as quite positive, right? A lot of gratitude that people are feeling for what they do have. And
Sure.
when that, a lot of introverts are like, thank God, I really don't like to deal with people. I'm happy to be here in my home. This is much better for me. I wish I could go to the restaurant once in a while, but, this is okay, right? But even with that, there's still grief, right? There's still something is gone. And so I guess, is that an important part? Like even with positive changes, I guess there's still grieving.
Right. Yeah, and I think again it goes back to acknowledging it. Acknowledging you have those feelings. How am I going to work through them? How am I going to release them so I don't have these trapped emotions that affect me in the future?
Mm-hmm. I did, someone recently asked me about a good book on grief, and I didn't have one, so now I do.
Yeah, now you can recommend the Sudden Loss Survival Guide. Very good. Thank you, Frank.
I am so sad. I've just noticed at the time that we're almost the top of our hour. And you guys, this has been such a helpful conversation. Just on a personal note, I noticed about halfway through that we were talking about this, that, I've told you guys, it's pitch dark outside. It's just bizarre, right? So it's just, and I've had this free floating anxiety today. And you guys really have helped me to understand, I was trying to go about the day like everything's normal, but it's such a tangible reminder right now that something is different, as you guys are saying, right? Like the world, things are happening, and you guys have both, and everybody who's contributed, helped me to understand, like, I can't just go around pretending like, like, oh, okay, it's just another day. There's something happening, and there's something to lean into. And I'm so grateful for that. Because already I feel that anxiety has lessened.
Oh, good. Yay.
Right now I can feel it's like maybe, it feels like more sadness. Like this is tangible reminder of what people are going through. Marlena, talking about having to maybe be evacuated. It's like, it's right there for people. But that's so much, I feel, so much like you were saying, it's like anxiety is just this, like, there's nothing to lean into. But if it's sadness, that's a different thing. So
you're kind of naming how you're feeling right now, which naturally soothes you.
It does, yeah. So I'm so really grateful to you, and I look forward to sharing this replay because I think this was a really, really important conversation for people to hear. So I know I'll be sharing it around, and thank you. Did anyone want to share anything before we go?
I would just say thank you. It was really nice, grateful to be invited, and it's really nice to sort of hear all these different points of view. Really, really rich conversation.
Mm.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Well, we're here every Wednesday. I hope you'll come back. They're always, just the authors from Mango are so amazing. And Debbie, thank you for everything you do for us.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
All right. See you guys
Bye.
next time, I hope. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Debbie.